Unfortunately, the end has come. It's the end for me with Mark in this brilliant series. The book, again, I've said it to many people who have been reading along with us, is The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And it comes together beautifully in this final chapter. And I thought to tee us up for your thoughts on creating an artificial consciousness rather than an artificial intelligence, I thought it was important to quote the following aspect from the book. You say, the hard problem asks why and how you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, in short, your experience of existence, could possibly spring from the physiological processes that occur in brain cells. These cells are not fundamentally different from those that constitute other bodily organs. So how do they bring you into being? Nice way to start. Over to you, our guest, Mark Solms.
Thanks so much, Aidan. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. So you want us to start with this so-called hard problem of consciousness. That's the term that was coined by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers. But it doesn't start with him. He coined the phrase, and I think it's a very felicitous turn of phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. But let me just go back a step and start with the quotation that you just read, which actually paraphrases Francis Crick, the discoverer of the double helix, and or the co-discoverer of it. And the way that the problem is posed there, I think, is probably part of the trouble. It is that the idea is that the neurons and the neurotransmitters that flow between them, that these produce consciousness in the way that, say, the liver produces bile. It's an organ sort of excreting consciousness. And that is truly a hard problem. If you try and get your head around that, how on earth can something physiological produce something conscious, something psychological? How can something material produce this immaterial sense of my existence? How does my body produce my mind? So that's the sort of standard way in which we formulate that problem. But it's not the only way to look on it. I think another way to look on it is not so much that the body produces consciousness as that there are two ways of looking at a human being or any other sentient being. You can either look at it from the outside, in which case you see a body, or you can look at it from the inside, from the perspective of being that body, and then you experience the being of that body. They are two observational perspectives on the same thing. So, just to bring this down to brass tacks, when I wake up in the morning with my eyes closed, I experience my existence. Thank God, I am Mark Solms, I'm alive. Then I open my eyes and I stagger over to the bathroom and I look at the mirror and I see this body there. And I think, oh, well, that too is Mark Solms. He too is alive. That's his body and his mind. The mind is what I experience before I open up my eyes. And my body is what I experience when I look at myself in the mirror. And these are not two different things. These are both me. But they are me observed from two different perspectives. So the being of me, the subjective perspective upon me, and the body of me, the objective perspective upon me, are two perspectives upon one and the same thing. A good analogy for it is lightning and thunder. Lightning we see with our eyes, and thunder we hear with our ears. So you look and you see this flash of lightning, and then you listen and you hear kabababumba, this clap of thunder. And you don't ask yourself, gosh, how did that flash of lightning cause that clap of thunder? It's the wrong question. the clap of thunder and the flash of lightning are two different observational modalities upon one and the same thing. So what is the underlying thing? The underlying thing is a flow of electrons through the atmosphere due to a potential difference from the higher to the lower altitude. And that is a theory called electricity. You know, there's an underlying abstraction about the laws of electricity, which explain what causes these the light waves and what causes these sound waves. It's one and the same underlying event. So we have an underlying abstraction called electricity, just as we have an underlying abstraction called Mark Solms. You can observe him in two different ways, but he's one and the same thing. So that's just to convey what I mean by the difference between two observational perspectives as opposed to cause and effect. I prefer to think of the relationship between consciousness and the brain as two different perspectives upon one and the same thing, the being of the brain as opposed to the looking at the brain from the outside, rather than asking myself, how do those cells produce this experience? They are just, two different, so that you can have a memory, that's an experience, or you can look at the neurons using a method called optogenetics. You can actually see the firing of the neurons. Those firing of the neurons are what you see with your eyes, and the having of the memory is what you experience if you are those neurons. Obviously, not just a little network of them, but a great many of them in some sort of neuronal aggregate. By the way, the neurons that you see firing with optogenetics, you could also listen to them firing if you have the right kind of apparatus. You hear spike trains, so what you see, what you hear, what you feel, these are all just different perspectives on the same thing. But it doesn't get us away from, the nub of the matter. The nub of the matter is still profoundly interesting, which is, well, then what is that underlying thing? If you can perceive this thing from these different observational perspectives, depending on what kind of apparatus you use, that's all well and good. So you're saying these are all sort of the phenomenal data, but what is generating all of that data? What is the underlying thing that we have all these different perspectives upon? That's really what the science of the mind in its essence, the science of the mind that both psychologists and neuroscientists are studying. They're trying to get to understanding that underlying thing. So we study memory systems and language systems and systems for executive control and systems for perception. And then you see all these diagrams, that's what you end up getting in our scientific papers. We're all studying the same thing called memory or perception or whatever. And we use physiological data or psychological data in order to get to this the understanding of the laws, the functional mechanism that generates all these phenomena. Depending on what instrument you use, you will see different phenomena, but we want to understand the underlying mechanism. That's really what matters. So the underlying mechanism is what this book is about. We've been on a journey together through the various chapters, and in that journey, we've slowly gotten to what the mechanism is, and I tried to formulate that in terms of what's called the free energy principle. A very important part of the free energy principle and other such principles is that they are neither physiological principles nor psychological principles. These are underlying formalisms. These are the underlying mechanisms which explain how both the physiology and the experience come about. So that's the chapter one, as it were, of what I wanted to say in response to your teeing me up to talk about the hard problem. The hard problem is, what is that mechanism? Not how do the two different sets of observing that mechanism relate to each other? And I think that if we think the hard problem is, how does this phenomenon, this way of observing it, cause this way of observing it, we're asking the wrong question. It's rather, what is the thing that both these ways of observing are directed at? So that underlying mechanism is what I've tried to describe, and it's no accident that I end up describing it in the language of mathematics, because it's an abstract language. It's a language that describes the underlying mechanisms in a language that's neutral. It's neither a physiological language nor a psychological language. It's the language of, well, Galileo beautifully said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So that's why this book ends up getting so mathematical in places. It's because we need an abstract language to describe abstract mechanisms, to get to the heart of the matter.
I thought I'd just mention some of the studies I learned from your book. These were amazing studies released, and these are years ago now. So this is 2012 to 2016, which is like the ice age in this research, how fast it's moving, when researchers showed that it is possible to create an artificial interface between the brain and the spinal cord to enable paralyzed animals to move their affected limbs by replacing spinal neurotransmission with radio signals. And then you went on to talk about other amazing studies, a landmark study in 2012 by Brian Paisley and colleagues, when they showed that it was possible to use a computer model to reconstruct the words that the brain had heard, which is amazing. And then you go on to tell us about dream recording, and that as this step towards thought recording. And those same researchers, I looked it up, Mark. I went down the rabbit hole, which you've sent me down many, many times, looking at this research, looking at videos of these teams. And they've gone on to do those studies of paralyzed animals to people now, where the robot is capable of touch, because they've affected the brain with electrical signals, which is just amazing. And I maybe you had a thought on that, because that really brings to life what you're saying, is that if you can bring this into mathematics, you can program it. And that tees us up nicely. Well, if you can program it, then can you go on to create an artificial consciousness?
Yeah, so what you've introduced, that's a very felicitous set of thoughts to introduce here, because what you've introduced is, which I think is your intention, to show that if you can perform that mechanism, it doesn't matter what the outward appearance of the thing is. The technical term or phrase that we use in these scientific contexts is that the mechanism is substrate independent. In other words, as long as the mechanism is there, it doesn't matter what it looks like or what it sounds like. So the pyramidal neurons that join the cortex to the spinal cord, that part of the spinal cord that controls movement in our muscles, we use signals going through those neurons from our cortex to our peripheral nerves to make our movements. Now, those signals are just information. It's a pattern of information which is fired. The neurons fire them. I mentioned spike trains a moment ago, brr, 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 like that. What those are ones and zeros. Yes and no. The neuron fires or it doesn't fire. And then there's a great, as I said, conglomerate of neurons. So there's a whole pattern of ones and zeros. That's really all that the neurons are doing. That's the mechanism. So you can look with your eyes and you'll see neurotransmitters and you'll see ion channels opening and you'll see the action potential traveling along the axon, and all of that is physiology. But if the neuron is interrupted, as happened in those unfortunate monkeys in the experiment that you refer to, Paisley's experiment, and as happens by accident I've had many a patient with a severed spinal cord. They can no longer move, although they can have the intention to move in their brains, in their cortex, because the axons are disconnected. Then they can no longer do it. So what Paisley did was put an array a recording array on the cortex of the monkey, recording what the intention was in terms of the firings of those neurons, then by radio transmitted it to a receiver in the spinal cord, which relayed that same pattern to the neurons beyond where the damage is. And then the monkeys were able to move. In fact, those monkeys were able to walk very adequately over uneven surfaces. And and as you said, Aidan, now we're beginning to apply this clinically in various ways for human beings with spinal lesions, and that's the kind of practical consequence of the thing that I was trying to say to you, which is that it's not the outward form that the thing takes that matters. It is the actual mechanism. That's what does the work. That's what causes the outcomes that we observe. And in those experiments, I'm focusing on the Paisley one because each one of those three experiments you mentioned introduces slightly different issues. But in all of them, it is information that is being recorded and transmitted, exactly the same information as is being generated and expressed as cortical activity or expressed as nerve impulses down the spinal cord. Exactly that same information can be sent by radio or can be recorded by a computer and then produce the sound that it had heard, even though there's the thought process that was it wasn't originally heard. It was just recorded from cortex, and then from that recording, it can actually say what the words were, that were being thought, and so on. The computer stands between the cortex recorded from and the sound that's produced. So that's what we mean by substrate independent. As long as the computer is performing the same information processing, it does the same job. So that's the next point. So I've made point one is actually what we're talking about is a mechanism. Point two is the mechanism. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It's what it does that matters. And now that leads me to point three. And this is really David Chalmers' version of the hard problem. David Chalmers says, well, that's all well and good, but the mechanism doesn't have to feel like something. You can say, yes, you can do a mechanism that causes movements, and you can engineer the mechanism that causes sounds, and you can engineer the mechanism that causes any externally observable thing. But none of those mechanisms has subjective experience. That is the hard problem, is why is there subjective experience attached to these mechanisms? And he says it exists in a different realm. The experience does. And he uses, and this is not only Chalmers, many people of that mindset use this example. It's called the knowledge argument. And it was coined by another philosopher named Frank Jackson. And I'm going to give his argument in a simplified form. In my simplified form, it works like this. Imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary. And Mary knows everything there is to know about how vision works. She knows everything about the physics and physiology of vision, the mechanism. She understands it perfectly, but Mary is blind. And then one day, by some great good fortune, the gift of sight is bestowed upon Mary, and suddenly, for the first time in her life, she has a visual experience. And Jackson's argument is that now Mary learns something utterly new about vision. Even though she knew everything about its mechanism, she did not know what it is like to see. And so the argument goes, therefore, everything about the mechanism explains the external observables, but it doesn't explain the internal observables. It doesn't even explain why there should be internal observables. It didn't predict for a moment that there would be internal observables. And crucially, it seems that the mechanism does exactly the same thing without the internal observables. So what are the internal observables for? And what do they do? And where do they come from? Because clearly they don't come from the mechanism. This is Chalmers's argument. And therefore, the phenomenal experience of subjective being, according to that way of thinking, exists outside of ordinary natural scientific causal mechanisms. And that's a spooky kind of way of thinking. That goes back to, this is body and soul, and the soul is an immaterial thing, and, it's eternal, and the laws of physics don't apply to it, and etc. I mean, Chalmers is a very bright guy, but he does end up saying, we're going to have to change the laws of physics or extend the laws of physics if it's going to be able to accommodate consciousness, because clearly, as we understand it now, the physical world is a closed system that doesn't have any place for experience, and we don't need experience. And when he says we don't need experience, let me just be clear about what's meant by that. When I said that Mary understood everything about vision, except she didn't know what it's like to see it, because her understanding of the mechanism didn't make any reference to that. There's good reason why it didn't make any reference to that. It's because I'll tell you two things about it. The first is we have many artificial apparatuses that can see, in the sense that, for example, your phone, which has a little camera in it, it can see in the sense that it can receive visual information. And not only that, it can recognize, for example, whether it's looking at a face or not. You know what your phone does. It sort of adjusts for the face. And then it can record that data in memory. So clearly everything that the brain is doing visually in terms of, receiving light waves, transducing them into something else, in our case, into nerve impulses, in the case of the camera, into little impulses in the chips that make the silicon infrastructure of the camera. And it recognizes, faces versus landscapes and so on, and then it commits them to memory. So all of that sort of visual stuff can go on without any experience. Presumably your camera isn't just like the blind Mary. Your camera, it's got all these mechanisms for vision, but it doesn't have any experience. So what is the experience for? You don't need the experience. And it doesn't seem to be part and parcel of the mechanism. So this is Chalmers' big challenge. He's saying, your science, Mark Solms, it's mechanistic, physicalist neuroscience. It's very good at getting to what the underlying mechanism is, but that mechanism doesn't have any place for experience. So this is, and the same applies, by the way, to the visual cortex. And this is why I said we're starting in the wrong place. It's exactly because the visual cortex can process information just as Mary thought it could. She's right. The visual cortex can process visual information in a highly sophisticated way and commit visual information to memory without any consciousness being attached. There's tons of experimental evidence that you can see things without knowing you're seeing them, and what you've seen affects your future behavior without you knowing that your behavior is now being influenced by what you previously saw because you didn't know that you saw it. So in this way, our brains behave just like the camera does. It does all this visual information processing and memorizing on the basis of what it experiences, but it doesn't actually experience in the conscious sense of the word. It doesn't experience anything at all. The cortex does the same thing. So this is why I have said, number one, cortex is the wrong place to look. If you're wanting to solve the hard problem of consciousness, don't look to the cortex, because the cortex is not intrinsically conscious. The cortex functions unconsciously unless it is aroused or activated by the upper brain stem. and by the reticular activating system in particular, which is called the reticular activating system for a good reason. There's absolutely no controversy about this, that the cortex is not intrinsically conscious. The cortex is rendered conscious by brainstem arousal. So the cortex is the wrong place to look. Vision is the wrong thing to study because vision is not an intrinsically conscious process, as Mary knows. It can work unconsciously. But the upper brain stem, which activates and arouses and renders conscious what goes on in the cortex, it does not produce vision, it produces feeling. This is the single most important claim, or not claim so much as just pointing out the obvious in my book, that the upper brain stem, which is the reticular activating system, which is specialized for consciousness, not for information processing, it's specialized for consciousness. Its intrinsic essential function is to render the information processing conscious. This part of the brain doesn't generate vision, it generates feeling. And my way of thinking is that you feel your way into your otherwise unconscious visual information processing, and that's how it becomes conscious. It's the feeling that's conscious, and then you feel your vision. So I've said that the hard problem arises for two reasons. The one is that we think, that the brain produces consciousness like the liver produces bile. I've said, no, it's two different ways of looking at the same underlying mechanism. And then Chalmers says, yeah, but the mechanism doesn't bring about consciousness. There isn't any mechanism that brings about consciousness. Look at the example of vision. And I'm saying, well, it's the wrong example, mate. If you look at the example of feeling, and here's the crux of what I'm trying to say. Just let me try and pause for a moment to place emphasis on it. That it's true that the mechanism of vision does not predict that it would feel like something to see. But the mechanism of feeling does predict that it would feel like something to feel. And it's not just a play on words. I'm not just saying, well, it's an oxymoron to speak of a feeling you can't feel. Remember, I'm saying empirically, the part of the brain that generates consciousness is the part of the brain that generates feeling. So if we understand the mechanism whereby that part, the mechanism instantiated by that part of the brain, then we will have understood the mechanism whereby feeling. If Mary was an affective neuroscientist, and she never had experienced any affects. Actually, by the way, if that were the case, she'd be in a coma. But let's leave that aside. If Mary were an affective neuroscientist and she'd never experienced affect, but she knew the mechanism, but affect is just the technical term for feeling. If she knew the mechanism whereby feeling or affect is generated, then she would know that it feels like something, because that's the whole blooming point of feelings. The mechanism is there in order to generate feeling, and feeling has certain fundamental properties. Number one, it's registered by the system. It's about the system. We're a system in this sense, this mechanistic way of talking. The system is registering its own states. So that's point one. It is therefore intrinsically subjective. Secondly, we are self-organizing systems. That is to say, we are systems which distinguish between ourselves and everything else. So this is me, that's not me. This is the system, that's not the system. So in two senses of the word, these systems are intrinsically subjective. They have selfhood. In other words, they have a point of view, the point of view of the system upon everything else. And it's monitoring what's going on inside of itself. That's what the mechanism of affect is all about. And then thirdly, it gives a damn about what it's monitoring, because what it's monitoring is its own viability. If I move out of homeostasis, I stop existing. If I move back into homeostasis, I continue to exist. So what it's measuring, the mechanism of affect, what is being monitored by the system in terms of its own states, is its own existential viability. So these are the properties I haven't finished my listing, but these are the properties of what a feeling is. A feeling is something registered by a self. In other words, a thing that has its own point of view. It's registering it subjectively. It matters to that something. And it's registered in an intrinsically valenced way, and that's another technical term, but it just refers to values in the sense that there's an intrinsic goodness and badness. If the measure is moving out of homeostasis, that just is bad. It mechanistically is bad because it means you're going to stop existing as a system. And it just is good if it's moving back toward homeostasis. So this is another fundamental property of feeling, which is that it has valence. Feelings have badness and goodness. Only feelings have intrinsic badness and goodness. And then lastly, we have to have categories of feeling because we have categories of need. We have hunger, thirst, sleepiness, the need to urinate, fear, rage, lust, etc. These are different things. So you need to know in what category am I out of kilter. If you just out of kilter in terms of hunger in some abstract way, and then you go and drink, it's not going to help. If you're lacking oxygen and you go and eat a hamburger, it's not going to help. So you need to know, I'm lacking oxygen. That feels like suffocation alarm. Or I'm thirsty. That feels like thirst. They're qualitatively different. In mechanistic terms, that means that they are categorical variables. You can't reduce them all to one common denominator. You can't say, I've got 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 4 out of 10 of thirst. That makes a total of 12 out of 20 of need. So I'll just sleep and never drink. You'll die if you do that. So you have to drink and you have to sleep and you have to eat and you have to defecate and etc. You've got to do them all. So they have to be categorically distinct in statistics. In the language of numbers, that just means that those variables are qualitatively different from each other, not quantitatively different. 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 8 out of 10 of thirst, it's the same number, but they don't mean the same thing. So affects work like that. So there you've got the mechanism. The mechanism of feeling is that it is a system which has a point of view, registering its own state in terms of its own viability. How well or badly, it's intrinsically valenced, am I doing in relation to a particular quality of my existence? That just is a feeling. So if you David Chalmers, who said that no mechanistic description will ever account for why things feel like they do, I'm saying, yeah, that's true about vision and a great many other things, but it's not true about the mechanism of feeling. So that brings us to the other profound meaning of those three bits of experimental or technological advance that you were referring to earlier. I said that what they show is that the mechanism is substrate independent. In other words, as long as the cortex is connected to the spinal cord via the correct information, in other words, the mechanism, this pattern of information in the cortex has to be transmitted to the spinal cord, to the motor effectors in the spinal cord. It doesn't matter what substrate is used. In other words, if you use the actual long axons going down the spinal cord to transmit that, to be the vehicle of that information, of that pattern of information, of that mechanistic causal process, or if you use radio waves, they end up doing the same thing. So that's what Paisley showed. You don't need a pyramidal neuron to do it. A radio wave can do exactly the same thing. And he demonstrated it in the simplest possible way. The monkeys walked, so there's the proof of the pudding. Now that leads us to the final chapter of my book, which is titled Making a Mind. So now take a deep breath and remember, so far, everything I've said to you is sensible.
Just a little piece that might be a nice connection, because I've been following you. I've read the book, as you know. So I'm going to throw into the melting pot lots of terms and as I understood them. So homeostasis, we all go towards homeostasis. I view homeostasis like a seesaw. So you're constantly trying to get to leveling the seesaw. When you do that, you minimize free energy, which is the gap between where you want to be and where you are, right? We're self-organizing beings, and we are homeostats. So even within our being, we have these areas, homeostats, and they are all surrounded, including us, by a Markov blanket, which is that point of interaction with the environment in which influences us and guides us. And with that all, we constantly want to minimize uncertainty, which is that eradication of the free energy. But the way we understand that is by feeling. And feeling does not come from the prefrontal cortex. It comes from the source, which is deep down in the RAS, the reticular activating system. That's the source. That's the wellspring of consciousness. And it's easy to program those things that go on in the prefrontal cortex because they are the information flow, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's a convenience to think that anything that doesn't have a prefrontal cortex, advanced prefrontal cortex, does not feel. For example, how we butcher animals, mammals, and as a result, we think, oh, well, they don't feel anything, they're not conscious. Okay, so I'm going to park all that and feel free to grab whatever pieces or correct me if I'm wrong in any of that, because it brings me to this interface, this Markov blanket between those two chapters. You said, as we previously discussed, it is conceivable that affective zombies might exist who behave as if they're conscious but are not conscious. How then can we ever know whether they really are conscious? The traditional answer is with a behaviorist test of intelligence known as the Turing test. We know that. But it's not actually a test of consciousness. It's a test of intelligence. So I hope, Mark, that's a nice little interface for you to grab onto whichever parts you like to build and propose the final argument, making a mind.
Yes, thank you very much, Aidan. Well, let me hook up first of all on the last thing that you said. This thing about philosophical zombies, by the way, David Chalmers is very keen on all of that, and this is the very point that he makes. He's saying, you can have this mechanistic robot that does all these things, that looks as if it's got a mind, but actually there's nobody at home. So, he's saying that this shows you, the mechanism is not what we're looking for. We're looking for something mysterious, something which is outside of science, something which you can't explain mechanistically. Like what I was saying about the sort of robotic, as it were, the artificial connection between cortex and musculature in Paisley's experiments, and the artificial connections between cortex and sound in the other experiment you referred to, the third one, where it was possible to see from the recordings of visual cortex, what was being dreamt. This is amazing stuff. But he's saying all of it is external, all of it is objective, all of it is physically observable. None of it is subjective. That was what Chalmers was saying. And I was saying, well, it's because you're looking at the wrong mechanism. The mechanism for feeling is not the same as the mechanism for movement or for speaking or for face recognition or whatever. I'm saying all of those mechanisms can carry on unconsciously. So to hook up with another thing that you've just said about the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex can do prefrontal cortical things unconsciously. We know that it can. It's the brain stem, the reticular activating system, feels its way into the information processing going on in the cortex, and then and I'll tell you in a minute why it does that. But before I do that, I can't resist the opportunity also to tell you that to remind you, Aidan, in my book, I describe a patient of mine, Mr. W, who has no prefrontal cortex. And I ask him, does it feel like anything to be you? And he thinks it's a ridiculous question because, of course, he's there. There's the sentient being of the person doesn't reside anywhere in the cortex, including in the prefrontal cortex. Another little thing to tell you about Mr. W is that, as I quote in my book, he makes a puerile joke in his conversation with me, and this is one of the things he's want to do. He's always making silly jokes. And this is what happens with patients with prefrontal cortical damage quite generally. They're known for what's the Germans call it Witzelsucht. They love to make little jokes. But more than that, they are full of affect. That's why they make jokes all the time. They are, in fact, disinhibited as far as affects are concerned. They are too emotionally expressive. They say things that maybe you and I would think, but we wouldn't say it. Mr. W and people like him, there's an outpouring of affect. So if the cortex was where the affect was being generated, then how come when you take the cortex away, you get more of it instead of less of it? So I said I will tell you in a moment why we feel our way into our cortical information processing at all. But the important thing for now is just to hold on to the thought that that what we are talking about is the feeling, not the perceiving or the thinking. The intelligence doesn't have to be conscious. The feeling does have to be conscious. And I'm saying that if you understand the mechanism of feeling, then it can be engineered artificially. It's substrate independent. So in other words, why would you want to do that? By the way, we're transitioning just so that because Aidan's always been going so carefully through chapters. Until now, I've been talking about chapter 11, which is about the hard problem of consciousness. And now I hope I'm remembering the chapters correctly. And now I'm moving on to the final chapter 12, which is entitled Making a Mind. Now, why on earth would you want to do that? There was a brilliant physicist. His name was Richard Feynman. And when he died, they found written on his blackboard. So it was sort of like his last words, not that he spoke them, but he wrote them on his blackboard. He said, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. And I think that's a very sobering and true statement. If you are going to claim, as I just have, that the mechanism of feeling, we understand it. It's an extended form of homeostasis. It's not something spooky. It's not something outside of natural science. If you look in the right place, you will find a natural scientific explanation for everything in nature. And if you haven't found it yet, well, keep on trying. Eventually you will. These are. I don't mean to be overly reductionist. I mean, if you're looking at simple question like how does feeling come about? Feeling is something that happens in nature. It's part of nature. Feelings exist. They exist all over the place, and they exist in living creatures, and they must be doing something, and there must be some way of explaining how they work. And so that's what this book tries to do. But then the following what Feynman is saying is that if you're going to claim now you've identified the mechanism whereby feelings are created, then you should be able to engineer one. You should be able to reverse the process, saying, okay, I've worked out from feelings and brain mechanisms that generate feelings, and I've come to an understanding that this is the mechanism. Well, on the principle of substrate independence, remember, I've used that phrase a few times now. If it's the mechanism that counts, then you should be able to make an artificial version of that, which will generate artificial feelings. And this goes again to Chalmers' story about philosophical zombies. If you've got the right mechanism in that zombie, it won't be a zombie because that mechanism produces feelings. So a robot that has this mechanism will be a robot that feels. I don't mean a robot that feels like you and me. you and I are not robots, but if we were robots that had the right kind of mechanism, we would have artificial feelings. We would have artificial feelings. In other words, we would have robot type feelings about how we're doing as robots. So if built into your robot is something like a need to maintain a certain electricity supply, that's what will matter to the robot. If the need of the robot is to remain within a certain temperature range, then that's what will matter to the robot. If the robot needs to not suffer too much damage to its component parts by banging into things, because if it bangs into enough things enough times and suffers enough damage, it will fall apart. Then that's what will matter to the robot. So just as there are things that matter to you and me, they matter because our very survival depends upon them. That's why it matters to me when I'm short of oxygen, and it matters to me when I'm short of water and short of sleep and short of, all of the things that we've spoken about so many times in our conversations. Those are our affects. Our most basic raw feelings are these values about our own existence, upon which our own existence depends, rather, I should say. If you engineer an artificial intelligence, it doesn't have to be very bright. Intelligence and feeling are not the same thing. Intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing. But you can engineer an apparatus that has these mechanistic dynamics. In other words, it's a self-organizing system with a Markov blanket, which has to, everything it does has to maintain its own survival. And all that you build into that artificial intelligence is the imperative that it must maintain these three homeostatic states. I just mentioned three now, about energy supply, temperature control, and tissue damage. By monitoring how it's doing and using its monitoring of how it's doing in relation to what's going on in the outside world, both in terms of its actions upon the outside world and the sensory feedback it gets from the outside world, it changes its model about how does the world work in terms of what must I do. What I did there didn't work. It didn't bring me back into my required temperature range. So I must try something else. And then something else does work, and then it updates its model. Okay, so that's how the world works. That's how the world works. Each of these things tethered to how well or badly it's doing in relation to its homeostatic needs, and it having to prioritize those homeostatic needs. They're not all the time running equally. One thing's going badly while two other things are going okay. Then its behavior all becomes about how do I find energy supplies? Once it's charged its battery, while it did that, it banged into several things. So now it's like, I've got a little bit of tissue damage here, and I'm a little bit overheated as a result of all of that activity. So let me just cool down my heat first of all. And once I've done that, okay, now I can do the tissue repairs. Okay, once I've done that, actually I've taken time, my energy supplies have gone down. Let me go and look for energy again. So, this is how the thing works. If it works by those mechanisms that I just described to you, then it will have artificial feelings about those sorts of things. And that's just, that is the kind of proof of the pudding. Remember I said to you at the beginning, not at the beginning of this part of our conversation, I said to you, I hope you have reached the conclusion that Mark Solms seems like a reasonably sensible chap, because I know what I'm saying now sounds crazy. I myself, when I first realized if we truly are claiming that this is the mechanism whereby feelings are generated, then we have to be able to reverse engineer it. And if we can't, then this is not the mechanism whereby feelings are created. That's what led me down this path. And so that's why for the last, actually, I think it's more than 3 years now, we've been working on exactly such a project. Interestingly, when I started, I think it was more like 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago that we started. I'm working with a team of physicists and mathematicians and roboticists and computer scientists on this thing. When we started, they were all a little bit wary. It was like, oh, everyone's going to think we're nutters. Interestingly, during those, at least over the last 2 years, suddenly everyone's busy speculating about whether ChatGPT is conscious or not. And it's now a pretty mainstream view, not only that artificial consciousness is possible, but sort of, whoa, be careful, by mistake we might create an artificial consciousness, and maybe we've done it already, and that sort of thing. So it's not quite as crazy sounding as it was when I wrote my book. I really did it with my heart in my throat. I thought, oh wow, all my credibility is going to go out the window here. But the fact is, this is following your own reasoning through to its own logical conclusion. So that's what we're doing. I keep saying I'm going to say why you have to feel your way into your cognition. So let me just put it like this, that the basic function of consciousness is I feel like this. I feel hunger, or I feel thirst, or in the case of our artificial consciousness, I feel dwindling energy supplies. This is bad. That's the first thing. It's the feeling. But then, secondly, it is, I feel like this about that. It's extending what the feeling is about onto your representation, your sensory motor representations, your representations of what you're doing and what's happening in consequence of it. So I feel like this about that is why you have to feel your way into your perceptions and cognitions and indeed your actions. And then, so we call those policies. And what I'm doing is I'm following a policy, and I'm not going to go into all the technical jargon of all of this, but it's just basically a sequence of actions is a policy that you predict will lead to a certain outcome. While you're doing that, you can't wait until it's too late. You're feeling, is this working or is this not working? That's what the feeling is for. So I feel like this about that. And basically to put all the mathematics into an absolutely simple phrase, it basically goes like this. It is good if things are turning out as expected. Good from the point of view of the robot. If things are turning out, if the policy is panning out. And it's bad if uncertainty prevails. So if things are not going as expected, so the feeling is about how the policy is the policy succeeding, or is it? So it's palpating all the time. It's confidence in its policy in relation to the ratio of predictions to prediction errors. Is what I expected happening, or is it not happening? Is it increasingly things are not turning out as expected, you reduce confidence in the policy and change the policy. And this is what our little robot does, and it does it brilliantly. And its only program is, you got to survive, mate. Up to you, And so there, in a very few words, I know we're short of time, Aidan. In a very few words, we at least got to what that final chapter is all about. And I can't end without at least saying one word about the fact that we are extremely mindful of the ethical implications of doing research like this. And so it's being done in the most careful possible way. And once we've reached the point that we think we have got to our criterion, in other words, that our robot is capable of having artificial feelings because of all of the ethical implications of that, at that point, we're going to, as we committed to in my book, we're going to stop the program. And we're going to call a symposium of all relevant stakeholders, and we're going to lodge the ownership of the intellectual property, not in any individual hands. We're going to lodge it in the hands of this group of people who are going to decide about how should we regulate this. Should we even go any further? If we do, under what conditions, not only in terms of the danger to us, but also in terms of the ethical obligations you have to a sentient machine. If the machine feels like something, it's a little bit like an animal. You can't just do whatever you like for experimental purposes on it. So I needed to at least get that in under the wire, but it's discussed much more thoroughly in the final chapter of the book.
You do indeed, and you discuss all this much more thoroughly, as you do with all the topics we've covered across the entire series. It's been an amazing series, and I had so much more, as you know, to ask. I was trying to get more time for Mark, but he's been so generous with his time. And Mark, you reminded me there of a Einstein quote, and I know you're a fan of Einstein. He said, "If at first the idea is not absurd, then there's no hope for it." So I didn't think at all you were being absurd or crazy at the end. And certainly it built up your credibility in all the other chapters. But I have to say, if you're going to put your hands of this conscious entity or this conscious robot into the hands of anybody, I'm very happy it's you. Having got to know you through this series, I trust you, and I hope everybody else does as well. For those people who have joined us all the way through, I'm sure you absolutely enjoyed it, and I'm sure many people working on AI have actually joined us on this because it is so timely. And I know it wasn't when you started the book. So bravo on that bravery as well of taking that bold step, Mark. All that remains for me to say is I am so grateful. You've given me many threshold moments of new ways of thinking about things, many great analogies and metaphors as well for organizational change and indeed individual change as well. So from the depths of my heart and from my reticular activating system, I want to say thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Aidan. Thank you for your interest and for the time that you've put into this. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you also for bearing with us. I'm very mindful of the fact that this is a complicated subject, you know. So it's for that reason that Aidan ended up giving so much time to it. It's because you can't possibly convey even the headlines of what the actual causal mechanism of consciousness is in an hour or two. So thanks for bearing with us. And I'm afraid if you read the book, you'll see it in more detail because it's even more complicated than we've been able to convey in our conversation. So let me end with a quote also from Einstein. Einstein said that in science, it's important to keep things as simple as possible. And then he added, but no simpler than that.
Absolutely. I love it, Mark. Brilliant way to finish. It's been an absolute pleasure. Author of this beautiful book. Look at that beautiful cover on it as well. It's a detailed read, as you got the hint of that, and it does require time. Hence, I usually cover a book every week. There was no way I covered this book. It took me 6 months to absorb it and absorb the theories and indeed get Mark's time. Author of The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, and creator of a conscious robot in the future, I'm sure. Mark Solms, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aidan.